Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So I'm Simon Ford. I work for a company called Blecon who builds smart beacon networks. So I'm guessing you guys are all familiar with LoRa, so think that sort of thing, but for Bluetooth Low Energy. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bluetooth beacons because they've actually come a long way, and a lot of people perhaps aren't up to date with where they are. So we're going to do a little history lesson to start, and you might even have to answer a question. Okay, so once upon a time, there was this. This was a very important device. It was the iPhone 4S. It was the one with the glass on both sides. You know, it was very aggressive in your hand, but actually a very nice device. But it was the first phone that had Bluetooth Low Energy built in. So this was a really foundational moment for Bluetooth Low Energy that had become part of the Bluetooth spec. Suddenly it's in a leading phone that is basically setting the way for this technology. But another thing happened at the same time, which is Apple built into it iBeacon as a technology, which was exploiting the Bluetooth advertising packets for what is effectively a micro-location system. So it was a really big deal. And, well, the use case and the things they talked about was, if anyone recognizes this, an old Eddystone beacon transmitting an advertising packet, and a phone can detect it. And in true Silicon Valley style, that means you can be told that there's a coffee you can have in the local Starbucks. So 100 startups sort of grow out of this. Actually, this still gets used, this technology, but this is what I think a lot of people remember beacons for. Some other stuff happened, so now we're going to go interactive. I'm going to give you a clue. Can anyone work out what happened next? Does anyone recognize who this is? I talked to one audience and they didn't have a clue who this was. Yeah, okay, right. Okay, have you worked it out? No? You haven't worked it? Okay, so this was a guy called Scott Jensen. He was at Google when I met him, and he was working on this concept called the physical web. So Google was all about URLs and interacting with things like that. So has anyone worked out the connection yet? Okay, you're into LoRa. So he was working on this thing called iBeacon. So that was Uri Geller. But the concept here, of course, was from Google's view of you could walk up to things and interact with them as if they were the web. So it was like physical web. So it was a way of representing URIs or URIs in beacon form. And I was working on this at the time. I was working on this chip, which was actually the first ever ARM chip with Bluetooth in a microcontroller. So I was working with Nordic. I was working at ARM. I was working with Nordic at the time. So this was a really quite an instrumental thing for ARM as in the microcontroller space, but also for Nordic. This was pretty transformative for Nordic as a company. They're here, in fact. So I was doing stuff to introduce Cortex-M to the world. So I built a thing called Embed, and we worked with Google to do the first implementation of iBeacon to allow people to do that. The date on this is quite embarrassing. It's quite a long time ago. And I was working with a company that I found when I was in Shenzhen called Minyu, and introduced them to Google so they could go and put these beacons out there. It's a very exciting time. And then this evolved to this, which is Eddystone. So this is a lighthouse in the UK. The combination of basically Apple launching iBeacon and Google launching what became Eddystone, so it evolved. This was really kind of the first phase of beacons, where it was really around marketing interactions. And that's kind of where Google took it. That's where Apple took it. But kind of industry did this interesting thing. Now this technology was getting exposed and also embedded into lots of these mobile operating systems. Industry kind of flipped it around. So rather than the beacon being fixed to know that you've turned up at a location as a user, they flipped it around that actually the beacon was attached to things that were moving, and almost the gateway was telling you, oh, it's arrived somewhere. So this was pretty fundamental, and to be honest, this is where most of the growth has actually come in the last 10 years. It's really quite impressive how widespread this technology became. And with that came form factors. So you can attach these things onto cages. These are rolling cages. You have people building sensors into these things now, so they can understand not only where they are but what they're doing, wearable form factors and things like that. So it's quite interesting how this has really exploded as a kind of industry. It's really massive. Even though it's not in consumer space, it's a really massive industry. One of the sort of IoT success stories, I think. Yeah, anyway, so you had this model, Eddystone, and people making proprietary formats to add sensors and things being picked up by gateways to so cloud systems could know where are things, which is quite an important problem to solve. And I guess what's interesting, certainly to me, is obviously I've been watching this and working on Bluetooth and lots of things. We're in this phase now where people are more constructing networks out of these things and network systems. So it's not about one gateway picking up something. It's actually collections of gateways, all that know about each other. And I think the consumer thing of AirTags or perhaps beacons embedded into products is the sort of one most people would recognize how useful this has been. And my company, we're building these sort of beacon networks for more commercial applications. So, as I say, think of it like a LoRa network, like Things network, but for Bluetooth Low Energy beacons, so people can build this into their systems. That's what we spend all of our time doing. So this is quite interesting now because suddenly your beacons can be spotted not just by, let's say, gateways, but by the barcode scanner in your warehouse or someone walking around with their GPS unit in their truck, or something gets to a point of sale in a terminal. Because all of these things have Bluetooth built in, these can all be acting as nodes in your network. So this is like one of those things that Bluetooth has an unfair advantage. It's in so much technology that can be exploited as hotspots. That's quite unique. LoRa doesn't have that. In the same way, Bluetooth has been done at such economies of scale in the silicon. Actually, the end devices can be incredibly cheap. And again, it's like another unfair advantage for beacons. But what's interesting here is these beacon networks are utilizing existing infrastructure. So this might be the capital that a company has already spent to kit out all of their staff with, let's say, handsets that are used for frontline operations. They can actually turn that on as a network. So that's quite exciting. And then if you look at these sort of basic beacons, the Eddystones and things like that, they're broadcast, they advertise. That's what they've historically always done. So they're quite limited. You can't know if your message has been received. Security is very limited because when it was imagined, it was just using for, you're going to get a Starbucks. So it wasn't really designed for that. And if you want to know something gets your message, you kind of need to put coverage everywhere to make sure you hear it, because there's no acknowledgement. So actually, from a deployment, you have to actually deploy quite a lot of coverage. And Bluetooth Low Energy, maybe it has 100 meters range, but it's certainly not, it's not kilometers or anything like that. But luckily, some other things have happened as well. So I talked about the first micro from Nordic I worked on. We're working now with the latest micros. So these are crazy powerful computers, much smaller, much lower cost. These ones are in 22 nanometer. So very powerful devices. And this is kind of the phase that's happening now. These beacons are starting to actually talk, become more like a two-way communication system like you would expect from a cellular network or something like that. Because they have these networks, they know where they are in space and time. Okay, that's quite interesting. You can afford to run proper security protocols and things like that. So that's essential, obviously, to know that really is the device you're talking to, or know that your data can't be modified and things like that. And as you saw, the processors you can put in these things are pretty advanced now, and that means you can run advanced software. But obviously, if you're running advanced software, that means things like two-way communication and security are important, because you want to be able to update the firmware because it's not right, or you want to improve your algorithm or something like that. Anyway, so this is really being driven by data, which is very interesting. So a lot of the early phases were driven by location, but a lot of the phases now, a lot of the movement now is being based on augmenting that with data and getting more out of not just where something was, but what it's been doing and things like that. So what's quite interesting, if we take that same example of spotting a cage and knowing where it is, well, if this device is smart, well, it can actually spot other beacons. So it can log, even when it's out of coverage, the fact that it's visited somewhere. It could actually spot another cage. So if two are on a truck and only one comes back, well, the one that came back can tell you about the thing that was lost in action. That's quite interesting. You can start logging events. So it's not just when a beacon comes back, it tells you, I went out of temperature. You actually know when it went out of temperature, and therefore, what's the intervention in my supply chain to go and fix these things. A lot of the requirements, it turns out, aren't actually about real time. They're about complete data. So people aren't looking to necessarily do an intervention on one particular product, one particular package. What they're trying to do is understand what's going on in a system, and then do an intervention on the whole system. So actually it becomes a data mining problem, a data analysis problem, rather than a real-time dashboard problem or something like that. Yeah, and when things get back, it can synchronize with the cloud, whether that's because a phone came nearby or a dedicated hotspot was nearby. So this is quite exciting. We actually wrote a case study last week with one of our design partners about this distributed environment and some of the things they've been able to exploit for their customer in that environment. There's some on our stand if you want to go and have a look. Anyway, yeah, quite interesting to see how these play out. And then I guess what also is exciting now, looking a bit further to the future, this is what beacons have historically looked like, but actually we're seeing a trend to them being embedded in printed labels. So they're not released yet, but on our stand we actually have some Bluetooth printed labels with printed batteries that we'll be releasing later this year, but also them becoming embedded into products where they're not primarily a sensor or they're not primarily a beacon device, but it doesn't mean that someone doesn't want location information or diagnostics information or to be able to do OTA or something like that. So despite them being, it's still an inhaler, actually augmenting that by embedding a beacon within it, it becomes really interesting. So yeah, these are sort of two trends that you can see. This is going to very much drive things where devices don't have to come back, low cost, recyclability, and things like that. This is actually beacons turning up in all sorts of products. You wouldn't even necessarily know it was there. Get analytics and things like that. Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me is when you start looking at it like this, it's become a proper IoT device. That's not how you would have thought about beacons perhaps historically. But once these same chip, different software, different network infrastructure, suddenly all these use cases get unlocked. And we're seeing customers play with all these sort of types of things. So from engineering operations, like being able to do OTA, engineering observability, being able to see, do crash dumps and things like that, through to actually analytics. It's a product. It's not even an electronic product, but I want analytics of how it's being used. So really quite interesting that non-electronic products are embedding beacons to understand how they're being used. Anyway, very interesting area. Cool. There's a paper there as well, if you're interested. And we have a stand out on the floor. Come and say hi. Love to answer any questions you've got and talk about anything that might be relevant to what we're doing. Thanks very much, all.